Hi, and welcome to the Learning Curve with me, Kenny. And in today's episode, we've again found a thought leader and an individual who is going to expand our understanding of what applications are possible for AI in the learning and development arena. With that, today's topic is applying AI to role playing learning scenarios. And with that, let me introduce Kayvon from Zal.ai. So, Kayvon, thanks for being on the show, first of all. And thanks for whatever information you're going to give us today. We're greedily awaiting some more input from you.
Thanks so much, Kenny. I'm excited to be here.
Cool. So, Kayvon, you have, like we said already, you have a company called Zal.ai. Can you give us a little background on your company?
Yeah, absolutely. So, the mission of our company is to help organizations measure the performance of their workforce, and
Mm-hmm.
as a result, help them improve and develop themselves into the sort of careers that they want to have and the careers that are most impactful for the companies that they work for in tandem.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we accomplished that using a really novel application of Gen AI that I'm excited to talk about.
Okay. That sounds like I said, AI is the hot topic. So um, I found it very interesting. All the various applications that one has. I'm really interested to see how that came about. So how did you? What was the idea that you founded Zal.ai, right? So
Mhm.
what was your impetus behind that?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about sort of the origin story of the company. So I've spent a majority of my career working in early stage technology startups.
Mm-hmm.
And I most recently was working at an edtech company in New York called Noodle, where I had the privilege of building a new lifelong learning platform to help universities distribute their non-degree content and courseware. And in the process of launching that product and business line for my prior company, I had the opportunity to speak with lots of uh, heads of continuing education and professional study at universities, essentially the schools that are responsible for things like custom ed that
Mm-hmm.
companies look to hire for, as well as like non-degree learning around, let's say, a certificate on data analysis or something to that effect.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what was interesting when I spoke to those, administrators who led the schools, is that they'd explained to me that companies would come to them and they wouldn't have a sense really of who needed the education at their
Mm-hmm.
organization, how that education would be applied in context of the role,
Mm-hmm.
and certainly not how it would be measured in terms of efficacy. I mean, I think traditionally learning and development, although so much money is spent annually around the world by organizations,
Mm-hmm.
and as they should, because it's such an important part of the work experience. Although so much money is spent, it has traditionally been very hard to measure the
Yep,
efficacy and impact of that investment. And
definitely.
yeah,
That's
and
always it's always the goal, I guess, is you're investing in education, of course, but how do you measure that? How do you put in a most in the simplest form? Um, Back in the day when you had, like, let's say a one-to-one coaching for salespeople, um, could you then basically measure that coaching on an effective sale? And now with the plethora of basically information we have and courses we have, content we have, like I said, we do a learning management system, so we also have content. And that, even for us, is also a challenge, that we get the measurables out there to basically help the companies understand, um, is the training I'm providing, is it working? Is it basically adding to my return on the investment, so to say? Okay, so I'm not the AI expert, so I'll defer to you on that. So let's take a look. Let's take a little closer look at the current state of AI in learning in the learning and development area. So, um, how has AI evolved in the context of learning and development from your perspective?
Hmm. Well, I think obviously it's evolved a lot since I think Gen AI has become sort of consumer, the consumerization of Gen AI, and
Hmm.
people have had a chance to play around with tools like ChatGPT. Um, so, I mean, we could talk about sort of what artificial intelligence meant before that day. But I think maybe what would be more relevant is to talk about sort of what it means now that we're all sort of, familiar with this technology, at varying levels. It might be that you've just, you know, interacted with ChatGPT once. It might be that you're a very sophisticated, application developer using Gen AI
Hmm.
um, in lots of creative ways, right?
Hmm.
I think fundamentally the shift that I'm seeing that I think is really interesting and that we see with pretty much any other major technology paradigm shift is there's there's an evolution from looking at all the things that we've been doing before,
Hmm.
looking at how technology has enabled us to do that thing, say, more efficiently, and trying to sort of use the technology to accomplish a task in the same way that we've done before, but just more quickly. Um, so let me give you a proxy to L&D.
Okay.
I think the most popular kind of application that we're seeing in learning and development is okay, well, we have courses,
Hmm.
and that's the unit of education that we're using to help people learn new things. And
Hmm.
so now we have Gen AI. So now let's help people author courses more quickly.
Yep, that's correct.
And I think we see that sort of paradigm in like every industry right now.
Hmm.
Where what I think is really exciting and where I think we're heading now is as this technology gets more stable and mature, and in probably a faster pace than we've seen in past technology paradigm shifts, is now I think we're asking ourselves the question of what couldn't we do before that we can now with technology like this. And that's where I think the conversation gets really exciting, and there's a lot of really interesting novel and innovative applications where we get to really rethink how and why and sort of what L&D looks like in context of an organization looking to upskill its staff. So that's kind of like a really high level in terms of how I see the Gen AI space kind of evolving, and specifically in L&D. And I think so far what I'm seeing is, and really recently, there are all kinds of companies popping up
Hmm.
that are introducing new learning modalities that didn't really exist before,
Hmm.
that are introducing new interesting applications of Gen AI that I think before no one had even sort of like conceptualized.
Yep.
And that's where I think there's a lot of excitement and intrigue.
Okay. But let, let me. The one question I had: do you see like also an inherent? Well, I think the point where AI is going to take over the world, Aya, like Terminator is not really out there. But do you see a a problem maybe with companies and businesses diving too quickly into using the technology? Sometimes maybe um, either their expectations might be too high, or um, they just don't really have a grasp of what they want to do with the technology. Do you see that as possibly being a problem?
I think it's definitely a problem. I think it's, you know, look, I'm a technologist, so I'm going to be bullish on the adoption of new technology.
Okay,
There's no
so
reason
you're an
to.
early adopter, so to say.
I'm an early adopter, so to say, for sure. But what I will say is, I think if you asked executives at organizations, do you wish you went through digitalization and and let's go through all the paradigm shifts, digitalization,
Hmm.
information technology, to adopting the internet
Hmm.
faster and 5 years ahead of your competitors. Do you wish you had
Ooh,
done that? I
okay, okay,
think
okay. Now,
I
okay, now you dropped it. You. Okay, that's case closed. Then in that case, if you're saying, you just made a perfect point there. If you're saying, would you have, as a business, any business, I guess, saying, would you have wanted to adopt that earlier and get a lead over your competitors? I mean, that's a okay. That's an easy one. Boy, you set me up for that one. Good. Awesome, awesome. I love that answer. Okay, so uh, looking at the trends, um, specifically, what what do you see influencing the L&D practices? I'm not sure if we answer that as part of your question, but I still would like to reiterate that just to make sure.
Sure. Yeah, we can go deeper. I think let's go like one click down in terms of altitude. So talking more specifically, like we talked about how um, I think initially people were thinking of, okay, well, we've got existing systems, we've got let's do what we've done before, but more efficiently. And now
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people are thinking in sort of a more innovative standpoint, like what can we do that we couldn't do before? Um, I think across L&D, we're seeing a lot of innovation happen, and it's literally occurring in every facet of what a learning and development professional needs to do to be effective in their job. So I'm seeing innovation around the sort of strategic planning
Mm-hmm.
of uh, applying a skills ontology to your organization, and what that
Okay.
planning process looks like, and how you would develop something like that to understand what are all the skills that we have in inventory at our company across our workforce, and how could that be most applied most effectively. I mean, I'm seeing a lot of innovation there, and I think anyone who's gone through the process of building a skill architecture for their organization can speak to the undying pain that is usually part of that process, and not just in the creation of it, the the change management that's involved with it, the maintenance that's involved with that. um, that's one facet of an L&D professional's job.
Mm-hmm.
And that, we could get into the actual content itself. I think you're seeing the most innovation there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that there's a lot of um, opportunity there, but I think there's also a lot of sizzle. And so people need to be careful about sort of the claims that are being made in terms of new training modalities.
Mm-hmm.
Um, of course, I think that there's also a lot of really, really interesting stuff happening. Um, I could speak to a few of those things. So um, I've I've noticed that beyond obviously again the ability to create courses with more efficiency, so Gen AI applied to course authoring, that there's also conversations of using Gen AI uh, or artificial intelligence in general to create new learning experiences that utilize things like digital avatars.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think that one really popular example that likely a lot of individuals have seen is using a digital avatar to change your text-based learning content into entirely video-based, where you have a digital avatar, talking about the content with a realistic sounding voice, and presenting it. And I think there's a lot of merit to that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But um, we can get into that more.
Okay.
And then obviously in terms of like the assessment point and sort of seeing like measuring efficacy and stuff. I mean, I'm obviously
Most
very bullish
definitely.
there. So
That's there's so many applications that we're seeing. I mean, we're also seeing you address it. Um, since we create a learning management system, to develop the skill tree. So in some at, at this point, you still have to go and basically set up everything manually and think it through. And I think even for us, the vision is at some point that with what is it, the natural language model, I guess, right? Or in any case, that you basically can describe your process, and the LMS will set it up according to that, and you don't
yeah.
have to go through menus and so forth and so on. And then on the other end, also you have the content creation, which I think will probably be my guess. I think that's the quickest one to adopt,
Mhm.
um, and the quickest one to really um, make traction, because there's a lot of tools coming out to help people create content quickly, efficiently, and so forth. Now, um, the only danger I see specifically in that is, having created some content myself, is basically that um, not everyone is educated on creating the content itself. So if AI can bridge that gap in making it, creating it in a didactical format, then that's what we're going to go to. So uh, I think it'll be exciting to see if that all comes about. So one of the things that we're focusing on, or the catch for us, was basically AI in role playing scenarios. So let's take a look at that. What makes role playing scenarios such a good learning tool?
Sure. I mean, I think, especially in context of online learning
Hmm.
and online learning at scale, it addresses one of the sort of biggest traditional problems, which is that um, a lot of online learning occurs in what feels like kind of a closed environment.
Hmm.
So you're absorbing a lecture or you're reading material, and it's typically not very interactive. I mean, I think the standard online course, we can expect to see some kind of video at best.
Hmm.
Um, and I think there's, merit to that and there's value to that. But we could talk about, what some of the principles are of active learning and why it leads to better knowledge retention and
Hmm.
sort of the learning science behind that. That's not my specialty. That's my co-founder's specialty. Um, but um, but taking from that sort of perspective, um, having something that, for example, involves a role play is hits on all of the sort of tenets of active learning. It helps someone really apply that knowledge in an active way, in an engaging way. um, and yeah, there's a lot of value to it. I think traditionally the problem with role playing is that being able to develop role plays that are in context and contextualized to the roles of, say, you know specifically at an organization, where the role
Hmm.
playing doesn't feel out of context and therefore lacks sort of the relevancy to the individual,
Hmm.
um, has been very challenging to do at scale. And I
Okay.
think, yeah, that's some places where Gen AI can be interesting for that.
Oh, well, shoot. Okay, you segued right into my next question. On
Cool.
that, and the question was going to be, what makes AI particularly suited for role playing scenarios in learning?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think anyone who's had a chance to play with, uh, you know, ChatGPT or any kind of, modern day Gen AI based chatbot,
Hmm.
um, will see that we have, we're capable of having some intricate conversations with artificial intelligence. And it hits on one of the biggest problems, again, with role playing, not just in terms of the contextualization piece, but in terms of the actual interaction model. Traditionally, the way that role playing is designed is essentially like a decision tree. So, you know, perhaps in the role play, the the actor, quote unquote, says something, and then you have to respond. And if you take option A or option B, if you go down this
Hmm.
path or that path, then it responds with this or that, and you go back and forth until the end of sort of the interaction. With Gen AI, like, that has turned into something that can be completely dynamic. And so there is no fixed chute that you're going down in a conversation, and conversations evolve much more naturally, just as they would in real life, or at least more so and closer to how they would in real life. And
Okay.
so
Okay.
um, there's the experience overall is more realistic, it's more in context, and therefore there's better learning transfer that occurs.
Okay. I have nothing to say to that. That's pretty encompassing. That's great. I was going to come up with another point, but you wrapped that up so well that I actually I'm at a loss for words. Okay, that happens often, but in this case, you really got me on that one. Okay, so um, let's look a little deeper into the whole thing. So how does you already touched on it briefly, but we'll go one step deeper since you're good at going always one level down or one click down. How does AI facilitate role playing scenarios, and mm, well, I don't know what is happening behind the scenes? Although
Yeah,
no, we'll leave the second part of the question out. I don't think I formulated that one good. Let's just take a look at how does AI facilitate role playing scenarios.
Yeah, it's a great question. So this goes back to, I think, the first point about why role playing is great, but traditionally been hard to execute at scale, is
Hmm.
that like for effective learning to occur, um, context is really important.
Hmm.
So using a principle of learning science in terms of near and far transfer, human beings are bad at abstracting knowledge and transferring it from one context to another. Let me give a classic example. If you took a surgeon and you
Hmm.
taught them about divide and conquer in the classroom,
Hmm.
it would be really hard for that individual to then take divide and conquer as a tactic and apply it to, say, their practice as in the operating theater. And
Okay.
this dynamic occurs and is, backed in research, you know, across humans. This is something that humans are just not very good at. And so instead of trying to solve for sort of nature,
Hmm.
um, what we want to help do is encourage effective transfer by creating the right context. So what does all of that mean? It means that instead of taking one generic role playing experience
Hmm.
that we have every employee at the company interact with that teaches something generic like conflict resolution, how
Hmm.
about instead we look at the jobs and roles of the individuals at these organizations and we develop scenarios that are really realistic and relevant to the types of scenarios that they would encounter on the job. And then we teach the same concept around conflict resolution, but in context of their role. And it's our belief that good things happen when you do that, because a lot of things click for the individual when you're able to teach them in context of scenarios that they're familiar with and then they encounter on the job.
Okay. Let me because I taught. We're working on a similar approach, but um, you explained it a little differently. And I was
Sure.
talking with one of my colleagues, and one of the visions he had was let's say the classic case would be um, you brought up the conflict resolution, um, and in a role playing scenario, his idea was that one could basically instill um, different personalities that you're interacting with. So you have maybe the just to put it plainly, like the yes sayer. So how does that there's not much conflict resolution because whatever you say is basically going to be agreed upon. But you can tweak the personality of the AI to be um, somewhat more robust or even um, let's say what's a good word for it? I'm losing my English vocabulary here. To be a little bit more aggressive. Um,
Sure.
so you explained it a little different though, um, because here you're teaching the AI to represent a different personality of individuals versus you've kind of formed it in the context of the role of the role of the individual in the context of the job. Is Are we talking about the same thing, kind of, or because I just picked this up, so I'm not sure if it's the. I think from my perspective, it's the same. We're talking about the same thing, but looking at it from two different angles, right?
That's right. And I definitely don't think it's a matter of either or. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
being able to offer scenarios that are in context of
Mm-hmm.
the sort of individual, as well as then being able to create variants uh, for that, for the application of, say, that skill, is actually another tenet of sort of learning science. And another classic example of that is, for example, if you want to teach someone how to play baseball,
Mm-hmm.
you wouldn't serve them the same exact pitch over and over and over again. Um,
Correct.
so that's, in theory, we're learning the same skill, right? We're trying to hit the ball.
Yeah.
But we want to create some variance in different looks, quote unquote, for what
Mm-hmm.
applying that skill might look like. And so we don't want to create a linear experience. And so that goes back to something Gen AI is really good at. I think the colleague that you spoke to
Mm-hmm.
brings a really great point that just like in real life, dealing with different personalities for a durable skill like conflict resolution
Hmm.
is a really important part. I mean, this is where skills and ontologies get messy, because in some ways now we're talking about your ability to adapt and
Hmm.
adaptability and in combination with another skill, if you will. Um, but um, but yeah, I mean, I think again, this is where, you know, I don't think we would be talking about what your colleague was talking about
Hmm.
even a year ago. Um,
Yes, that's
and so I
correct.
think that's where this sort of new lens that's happened so quickly with, okay, forget about doing the same thing that we did, but just doing it faster. How can we do things we've never done before that we know are going to lead to more effective learning?
Hmm.
Um, and how does Gen AI sort of enable that new sort of landscape for us? That's where I get really excited.
Okay, I wanted to get one more opinion because this is one of the things that I had when this kind of matches when we're talking about the benefits of role playing and the use of AI. um, One of the things was that when let me do it in form of a little story. When we created content at some point, and the question was whether to use real life images of individuals or to use cartoons. And the choice was then for cartoons or drawings and so forth because um, this the how the learner interacted with drawings was different than with real life images, and that brings us to current now AI. Um, do you think the interaction is more uninhibited for an individual if you because we're talking about like emulating, let's just say to the coaching scenario, you're talking about emulating a coaching session with an individual like one-to-one, and that's replaced with an AI. So do you think that interaction becomes less inhibited because you're not thinking, oh, what's this person across from me going to think when I say, how would you tackle this situation? And you say, well, I would just kick him out of the office, And you know, for a real live person, you might be going like, well, if I say that, I might sound like a jerk. But AI, has the advantage of being completely neutral. I mean, or I mean, is that what do you think of
Uh,
that?
yeah, it's a bit of a loaded question. I think there's been a lot of interesting research that's came out around sort of the inherent biases with AI.
Hmm.
Um, but I do think that there are interesting ways that you can get around that if you have sort of a well-designed application,
Hmm.
and there are some ways that you can't get around it, and it's sort of implicit with the technology. But what I will say is, I think you're right that there's a really interesting sort of dynamic at play here around um, sort of how someone would express themselves and articulate themselves to an AI versus to a human being,
Hmm.
and the self consciousness and or lack of self consciousness
Hmm.
that they might be experiencing, and therefore, again, how they would then express themselves. Um, if we again abstract this to just a standpoint of like data input, this is where I think language is so interesting. I mean, to your point, I mean, if we're talking about a tool and we talked about sort of typing it, writing down numbers versus typing them into a calculator, I don't think there's any difference. But when you
Hmm.
introduce this concept of people and communication,
Hmm.
you're exactly right that people treat those situations differently depending on who they're speaking to.
Hmm.
Where I think that gets really interesting then is playing with that concept.
Hmm.
So again, speaking to uh, something your colleague mentioned, um, it's not just about sort of how you respond in the situation, but how are you responding to how the other individual is interacting with
Hmm.
you. And I think there's a lot of really really interesting things that we can identify. The last thing I'll say about this is I think a lot of what we're talking about is related to sort of this Dunning Kruger effect of um, it's about sort of like um, perceived mastery. So the Dunning Kruger effect talks about perceived mastery and this
I'm
idea
glad
that
you brought it up because I would
yeah.
have asked, "What the heck is the Dunning-Kruger effect?" I'm like, I'm looking here trying to trying to look at notes, trying to figure that out. I don't have an editorial team behind me saying, Dunning-Kruger effect is this. I'm like, so please
Uh,
enlighten me and the
sure.
audience.
Yeah. So it's a really the visual for this. The graph is really interesting, but essentially, you can think of it as this: that there's a cognitive bias where people overestimate their own knowledge or abilities when they lack expertise, and
Mm-hmm.
so as you gain more, so when you first start out doing something, you tend to think that you're much better at it than you actually are, and
Mm-hmm.
as you do it for longer, you start to realize I actually don't know that much, and then you hit kind of a trough where you have sort of the self realization of I have so much to learn, and
Mm-hmm.
then you slowly start to actually increase your knowledge and skill and ability. And so
Mm-hmm.
it's a really fascinating study that sort of demonstrates a really common dynamic we have when we're learning new things. And
Mm-hmm.
so uh, I bring that up because I think again that's like exactly to the point of what we're sort of speaking to in terms of like interacting with a human being and your ability to do so. I think a lot of people think that they're excellent communicators, that they're really good at dealing with people, especially new managers. And then, with experience, and a lot of times through understanding through, say, like a mentor or coach, they realize, oh, wait, I'm not actually that good at that. And that sets them on a sort of a course. I think AI has a tremendous potential to help people sort of realize they're Dunning Kruger in a
Mm-hmm.
way that doesn't feel as personal because they're not getting that feedback from another human being where they might feel judgment or they might feel, oh, well, I thought I was so good at this. And actually, I'm not. But that's what such a great application of AI. And I think anyone who has a desire for mastery in terms of them, personal, work based, anything,
Mm-hmm.
having something like that, I think is really, really powerful. So
Okay, you've definitely enlightened my day with some uh, uh, real interesting information. So I'm gonna have to look up that again in more detail and read up on it. But that's really cool. So we've talked about some of the benefits, um, but what would you say are the challenges or limitations? So um, what challenges or might an organization face when implementing AI role playing?
well, I think a couple challenges. One, you know, if you're an ambitious organization and thinking of sort of, doing it yourself,
Oh
you'll
yeah,
find you'll
that's might
find
be a
that
tough one.
it's pretty complicated, both from a technology standpoint
Hmm.
and overcoming some of the limitations of the technology and the biases, et cetera, as
Hmm.
well as sort of an application of that technology through effective learning design that's baked in real learning science and not
Hmm.
just kind of like an edutainment type of experience.
Hmm.
Um, but actually leads to great learning outcome.
Hmm.
So I think that's one of the big challenges. I think one of the other challenges um, is, and if we are so brave, is the in terms of the technology, it's still really important to have a human in the loop strategically in this
Correct.
process. And so, for the audience, the concept of human in the loop is essentially this idea that we're not fully automating things end to end
Hmm.
with Gen AI, and we shouldn't be. What we should be doing is thinking about where we can strategically place a human being that has the sort of knowledge and skill and ability to review work or make revision to an outcome that Gen AI has produced to ensure and validate the result. And I think the right way to think about this is how can we go as a human being where, for example, we're spending, let's say, 50% of our time writing and uh, again, this is just broad strokes,
Hmm.
50% of our time authoring and 50% of our time editing. And when I say
Hmm.
authoring, I'm not just talking about courses. I just mean in general, like actually the ones doing stuff
Hmm.
versus like editing and revising stuff to a place where uh, we are we are editing more things. Let's say 80% of our time is actually spent editing, and the 20% of stuff time that we're spending writing, authoring, creating is much more strategic in its intent.
Hmm.
Um, that dynamic shift allows us then to be much more productive and get more things done, just point blank. And I think designing a workflow or process that enables that is, it can be very powerful.
And I think that's, you made once again that, brings us back to the beginning of the conversation, where you said, what benefit am I drawing from AI? And it's exactly this shift from, doing, you know, I'll put it, a little simpler, repetitive, tedious tasks to being more creative. And I think the argument that you made is very, 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 very important. Is to basically have a human element in this whole loop, which verifies the outcome of what the AI is putting forward. There has to be some type of control mechanism to ensure that the quality and even the content is up to par. So I think that's a very good example. So let's move on to real world applications, because we're heading down the home stretch here of our podcast. Um, what would you say? Can you share a success story or a case study where AI role playing made a significant impact in an organization's training program?
Sure. I mean, there are so many really, really interesting ones. I don't want to just talk about what Zal is doing, because I think
Mm-hmm.
for the audience, we should be talking about, I guess, the industry overall and sort of the
Mm-hmm.
dynamic shift. Well, I'll give a couple examples that I've seen that are really, really promising, that I think are really interesting. Um, Specifically, let's look at a department like sales and sales training and
Mm-hmm.
sales enablement. Um, I've been talking to a lot of executives and learning leaders that have been talking about using role playing training
Mm-hmm.
to train their sales force on interacting with leads, virtual leads, and dealing with different personality types and working through objection handling,
Mm-hmm.
and essentially being more well trained and ramping up more quickly than had they just sort of been going through the typical kind of sales enablement onboarding process.
Mm-hmm.
Or, of course, what a lot of training salespeople's jobs look like, which is kind of, getting thrown to the wolves and it's sink or swim.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, what that means in a tangible business outcome is you have a faster ramp up for those sales representatives. So,
Mm-hmm.
again, if we want to talk more specific numbers, if a sales representative has a quota of $200,000 for the
Mm-hmm.
year in terms of new business, and the first year there's traditionally a 6-month ramp up, it means that the first year they're only bringing in $100,000, and obviously there's a lot of money invested in training.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we can, for example, apply role playing based training, which in theory should be more cost effective
Mm-hmm.
and help knowledge transfer more quickly, and we can cut that ramp up in half. uh, Now all of a sudden your sales reps are producing, let's say, in 3 months, and therefore in the first year we might be able to expect $150,000 worth of quota,
Okay.
which spread across the organization becomes tangible. So I think a lot of these AI companies are targeting the profit centers within organizations because they can make pitches like the one I just made.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a little bit different than what we do
Mm-hmm.
for a variety of reasons, but those are some of the ones that I think in the short term you're seeing success stories and a lot of excitement around that's being talked about in the industry.
Most definitely, most definitely. I would agree with you. And even, the added perspective or the add on to that is that, um, once again, through Corona and so everything's become, like remote. And here again, the application, and we already have scenarios where you can train remotely, but this, just reinforces that whole concept that you can now train your sales personnel at any time, any location. I mean, you can even, people are doing workations, so in that time you can still learn and do something productive. So lots of good stuff going around there. So from the practical examples, let's take a look at the close to the final topic before we wrap up.
Sure.
Engagement and outcome. So um, how how have you seen learners typically respond to AI driven role playing scenarios? How's the response been on that?
Yeah. I mean, in our experience, what we've seen is a lot of intrigue, a lot of interest, and I'll share why. A lot of the employees, and back to one of your earlier questions around, hesitation from management adopting these technologies.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I would bet that a lot of your workforce is playing around with this either in their own personal lives, if not in some ways professionally, even if they shouldn't be, because they see all of the potential and productivity boost that they can have by utilizing it. And therefore, a lot of the individuals that we speak to who are on the sort of end user experience of the learning are really excited because
Hmm.
they like this technology and they see the benefit and application and how it can take a process, for example, like you were just talking about around engagement or um,
Hmm.
like they see how this can not only create a more engaging experience but also create sort of an objective uh, feedback loop for them that is inherently less biased than you know the loaded type of feedback that one might receive from a manager or from a colleague or from
Hmm.
someone in their organization where there's just a lot of interpersonal history there
Yep.
that doesn't really exist with robots. So,
Hmm.
uh, yeah, so that's what I've seen so far.
Okay. Okay. So that's good. Then we got. Oh, we still got some time. So let me make use of that with two more questions.
Sure.
Let's take a look at. Well, we're already. It's kind of weird when you do a future when you're already at the cutting edge of this. So we're talking about things that in part have already been realized and in part are still in the process of being realized.
Right.
So, um, but still, let me ask you still the question: what do you see as a future? Um, or a trend in AI learning and development, specifically for role playing scenarios? I mean, that's a tough question, I would say, but
No, I think it's a fair question. I think the you're gonna think of I think that what you'll see is across sort of the stack of different product features in
mm-hmm,
relation to something like a role playing training experience is going to just get better and better. So if we think of this abstracted to like the input, so how are we getting data into this thing?
mm-hmm,
Right now most of these experiences are text based.
mm-hmm,
We like and others have done this as well. Like I think the next step that you will already see is voice to text.
mm-hmm.
So and I've already seen with voice to text really really fascinating differences in terms of the input that we collect. People tend to give a lot more information when they're just kind of talking out loud about something than
Mm-hmm.
if they were typing, where they tend to be this is totally anecdotal, but where they but from what I've observed it tends to be sort of more tight in terms of how you communicate when you're typing something
Yes, most
versus
definitely.
when you're speaking and you're kind of thinking out loud.
Mm-hmm,
But then let's take that to the next step. um, what about true voice based uh, input? Meaning I can provide my voice and uh, it impacts, the sort of experience that I'm giving the information in. Next step from that, sentiment analysis. So, what if instead of just listening to my voice, I can tell the sentiment behind the way I deliver a message? And
mm-hmm.
is my delivery angry? Am I surprised? Am I joyful? Am I supportive? Am I empathetic? How is that impacting the way that my message is being received? And then let's take it one step more. What if, in addition to that, we had video based technology that's doing body language
Mm-hmm.
and sentiment around your body language? Maybe you're giving a very joyful message, but you're coming across very anxious and peeved. Well, that could be perceived as passive aggressive. So maybe
Yep.
you're not actually doing so.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's just the input. Like effective role playing has many, many components to it. So what you're going to see is, this becoming just more realistic, more scalable,
Mm-hmm.
easier to deploy. It'll become cheaper as it becomes commoditized. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
just like anything else, I think. But I think all that stuff is really, really exciting for anyone who's a lifelong learner and the sort of potential for learning new things.
Okay, Kayvon, you once again you've exceeded my expectations because I had pointed out that I thought this was going to be a tough question, but that's why you are where you are because not I mean like I said to me it's still like a new frontier, and you're not only out on the new frontier but you're pegging out a new frontier out at the new frontier, so you're fantastic. Love the answer very much, and I think it gives us insight in what to expect. So we're almost up to the deadline, but I have two more things. Final
Okay.
question is going to be, or final question before we get to the wrap up, is going to be, what advice would you give learning and learning development professionals who are considering incorporating AI into their training programs? Is there like something, like a generalized advice that you can give? You addressed it, I think,
Yes.
earlier already. I think when you said, that maybe you shouldn't go at it with, without professional help.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think like as like a more like broad strokes advice, which is what I think this question is sort of getting at,
Hmm.
I would just kind of reinforce the importance of of utilizing, like, not losing sort of the story,
Hmm.
so to speak, in terms of why we're even using this technology. So not deploying it for the sake of deploying it, but going back to um, what makes effective learning, which I
Hmm.
think can be or sort of sourced by what research do we have and what science do we have around what effective learning looks like,
Hmm.
and then working forward to how could I use this new technology to enable great learning outcomes.
Okay.
I think that's really like the crux of
I like
of
that one.
my advice.
So
Yeah,
use it for basically for the core idea of increasing your learning, and not just because it's in vogue, so to say. I mean, that's putting it really. I taken your beautiful explanation and reduce it to like a minimalistic expression.
no, that's great. I agree.
Okay, so Kayvon, thanks again for this great conversation. We'll leave the conversation um, with this final thought from you, which is, what is one thing that you hope that the listeners will take away from this conversation?
I hope the listeners listening to this uh, conversation will feel that using Gen AI isn't something intimidating or something that they need to be, discouraged from experimenting with,
Hmm.
and that there is, professional help out there and people dedicating their careers into thinking on how to leverage this new technology,
Hmm.
but doing so in a responsible way that's backed in real learning science, and that the future is bright, and that we don't have, in my opinion, something to be afraid of when it comes to artificial intelligence and sort of the scare stories that you hear, but rather a really exciting new potential, especially as someone who's passionate about learning, passionate about teaching. It's a whole new world, and that's really exciting. So I hope that's what they gather.
Okay, so we can put a net, set aside the Skynet things, right?
I would hope so. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Kayvon, then, since you're such a wealth of information and knowledge, which you've provided throughout the podcast, then to wrap this up, are there any resources, books, or websites that you can recommend for professionals interested in this topic?
Yeah. My co-founder recently authored a book called Active Learning with AI.
Hmm.
Dr. Stephen Koslin.
Hmm.
Would definitely recommend anyone to go check that out. You can find it on Amazon. He's in the process of authoring another book.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm a really big fan of his writing and his work.
Okay.
Um, and that would be one of the big ones that I'd recommend. And
Are you
then
writing a book too? Haven't thought of
maybe
that one yet, huh?
no, I haven't. Maybe though. And
Okay.
so yeah, I'd say start there.
Okay, so we got two for the price of one. Actually, we have you in the podcast, and your colleague, of course, who has written a book. So I think there's a wealth of information out there for the people. So thanks again, Kayvon, for your insights, and to our listeners out there. Um, as always, if you like the podcast, smash a like button, or even better, subscribe. And should you have any questions or any feedback, just drop me a DM. And if you have any questions to Kayvon, we can also link his internet site so you can take a look there. Kayvon, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much. And I think we almost made a point landing. The podcast was scheduled for 45 minutes. We're now at 49 minutes. and your hard cut will still be doable. So
I
thank you
appreciate
very
that.
much, Kayvon. It's been a pleasure. And yeah,
Likewise. Thanks, Kenny.
thanks.